All right, and in particular, I wanted, given the theme of the meeting, I wanted to talk about paleo artist. Oh, I guess that doesn't work on there. Look at that.
Oh, no.
John Conrad Hansen.
Pointing at the...
Oh, at this?
yeah.
Does that work?
I guess not.
Nope.
That's magical thinking.
Oh, it works. It just doesn't work on this.
No, it did work a few minutes ago.
Did it?
I absolutely need
I don't
it
know.
for mine,
I don't
so
understand.
without that,
It's all right. I'll just.
Have to get a good old...
I'm standing right here.
Yeah.
All right. So Johan Conrad Hansen, that was his born name. He was born in Norway on 4 August 1869. He received the equivalent of a grammar school education in Norway. In the early 1880s, however, he and his family emigrated to Minneapolis, Minnesota, which, for those of you who don't know, is an American city with a very large Scandinavian immigrant population. Johan's brother Carl was the first to find work at a dry goods emporium. Has anybody heard the name Carl Hansen before? Ah, okay. A well-educated man. So Carl Hansen, it turns out, is a very famous musician, journalist, Norwegian journalist, published his own newspaper for a while, wrote some novels. This is just sort of incidental to my talk, but what's important here is that Carl, because he was so famous, it turns out does have an archive of personal papers in an institution in the United States. So where formerly I could find out nothing about John Conrad Hansen, when I discovered that he had a famous brother, I was able to find his collections, and that wound up being by far and away my most important source for this project. So it was Johan's correspondence with his brother Carl that produced almost everything I know about John Conrad Hansen's history.
Actually, if you toss that down here, I could put new batteries in it just in case. Because I need that
This?
for mine, absolutely.
Oh, okay. I don't think it's a battery issue.
I've got spare batteries.
Okay.
I just need this.
All right, so at age 13, Johan became an apprentice at a lithographic engraving company in Minneapolis, a Minneapolis publisher, basically. A publisher, by the way, that sometimes worked on the Minnesota Geological Survey's publications. So he may have even worked on fossils as a very young man. In 1892, he moved on to the Monash Lithography Company, where he worked intermittently as an engraver and also as an artist for some 30 years. There are no records. I don't know exactly how long he worked there. He was eventually naturalized as an American citizen in Minneapolis in 1887, and it was at that point that he anglicized his given name to John, becoming John Conrad Hansen. His brother, however, always called him Conrad, so that's how I often refer to him as Conrad. All right, oh, then there's a picture of Carl Hansen, by the way, a portrait painted by John Conrad Hansen. Should have advanced that later, or earlier rather. All right, now since his early youth, Hansen had painted portraits, landscapes, and figures in oil. So this is something he did sort of as a side interest. It was his hobby. Now we know he moved to Chicago for unknown reasons in the late 1920s, and he opened a commercial art studio there in 1929. There he specialized in religious and historical art for greeting cards, for calendars, and for church programs. So a fairly narrow field of interest. Later he started painting portraits from photographs, so he would be hired to paint portraits from people's photographs. He also exhibited art. He painted landscapes. He exhibited these landscapes at various art shows in Chicago, particularly at the Art Institute of Chicago, for those of you who know the art scene in Chicago. Now in this way he was able to make a fairly modest but dependable living through commissions for his art. Art became something of an obsession for him, as well as a means of making a living. I have some desire to be known as an artist, was what he explained in one of the many letters to his brother from this era. In other letters he also explains how art had given his life new purpose and meaning. Art for Hansen had a kind of a redemptive quality, which I'll explain later if there's time, but there probably won't be. All right, now, unfortunately, of course, he moves to Chicago at the very beginning of the Great Depression. And of course, the Great Depression suppressed the market for art in Chicago as elsewhere. And so by the middle to late 1930s, Hansen had fallen on really hard times. He was no longer able to make a living. Hansen began working at Chicago's Field Museum of Natural History as part of the federally funded New Deal relief agency, the Works Progress Administration, or the WPA. He probably started in 1938, although I don't have a record for that either. I don't have an official start date for him. This is just a guess. I know he was there at least as early as 1939. But I also know he'd been there for a little while. Now, Hansen, because of his experience as an engraver, was assigned to do pen and ink illustrations for scientific purposes. I don't know if you know much about the WPA, but people were mostly given manual labor, but they tried to find things that people already had skills in. So people who had experience in construction were given jobs building bridges, building roads, building public institutions. Because Hansen had experience as an engraver, the Field Museum thought he would be an excellent scientific illustrator, although he had no previous experience doing this that we know of. All right. Now he also, in addition to the scientific illustration he was doing for the museum, he also rendered hundreds of background paintings for portable habitat dioramas that circulated through Chicago schools via the Harris Public School Extension Program. That's not Hansen, by the way. I couldn't find a picture of Hansen painting these backgrounds. But that's one of the portable habitat dioramas, and he's painting this background in with a couple of foxes. It's not a great picture, but it gives you some idea of the kind of minute work that Hansen was doing for the Harris program. Now Hansen's apparently very vivid paintings replaced the tinted photographic backdrops which had previously been in these kinds of dioramas, but that were found to produce a fairly unconvincing illusion of reality. So they weren't very satisfactory. Now, I've not been able to determine if any of Hansen's original Harris background dioramas survive, but I'm hopeful that one of these days someone's going to stumble on one that has Hansen's signature on it. I really hope that to be the case. So far, no good, though. All right, now Hansen did the majority of his work at the Field Museum on behalf of the geology department. Unfortunately, there's no complete record of Hansen's work for geology, so I have no idea, actually, exactly how many scientific illustrations he did for geology. And of course there's no way to reconstruct this information either. All I can do is approximate it. Of course, many of these works of art that he did in geology were ultimately published in the scientific literature, where credit was normally given explicitly to Hansen. Not always, but normally. And so I have some idea of how much he did. I'm yet to make an inventory of these published works, but one of these days I'm going to get around to it. Now, at the same time, though, his productivity for geology can be reasonably estimated at least several hundred drawings. And this figure is based on some data I have from 2 of the 14 years that he served at the Field Museum. So that's all I know. I have a record for 2 of those years for his productivity. So I know in 1945, for example, and this was a year when scientific productivity, of course, was very low at the Field Museum. This was, of course, the last year of the Second World War. But during this year, when he worked most of the year, according to some records, for the Harris Extension Program, he nevertheless produced 27 drawings for geology. Now in 1948, the only other year that I have hard data for, he worked 11 months for geology and then 1 month to the Harris Extension Program. And his output in this year was 140 drawings and paintings for publication and exhibition. So it's fairly high productivity. I don't know how many of you are paleo artists, but that number impressed me.
It's a lot. Where you think about it, it's one every couple of days.
It's a lot, yeah. He was a very busy man. All right, now the late 1930s, when, of course, and this again was when Hansen first arrived at the Field Museum, this was a period of unusually high research productivity in the geology department, and this was especially so for the vertebrate paleontology staff. Now, this work was driven largely by ambitious young fossil mammal researchers like Brian Patterson on the left and Paul McGrew on the right, and also by their mentor and one of my heroes, Elmer S Riggs in the middle. I've got an assortment of some of the illustrations that Hansen did for these paleontologists, so I'm going to go through these, and I'll linger on them a little bit. So this one is Andrew Zornis. This is an Argentine terror bird, for those of you who don't know. We've got Oriole. This is a Miocene herbivore from Nebraska. A lot of these animals are from Nebraska. That's where Paul McGrew hailed from. This is Promartes. This is... Oh, that's Astrapotherium. I must have missed one, or I deleted one of the slides. Sorry. So that Astrapotherium is the last one I have. Now, as it happens, scientific illustration at this time had become something of a logjam that was slowing publications at the Field Museum. So Hansen's timely arrival in 1938 filled a critical need in the geology department, as well as for other departments in the museum. In fact, Hansen's productivity was so great that the logjam then shifted down to the printing office. And of course, the Field Museum's director's solution was to ask the curators to reduce the number of illustrations in their publications, although without affecting the quality of the publications. So a typically impossible museum mandate, of course. But it's for this reason, right, that the research became, there was this logjam at the printing press, right? This is the reason, I think, that Hansen now shifts his work from illustrations for scientific publications to full-color reconstructions for exhibit purposes. And this happens beginning in December 1940. So thus, Hansen's second major body of work for geology consisted of a series of paintings and drawings done for exhibits. And this is, of course, what I wanted to focus on today. Now, only a small fraction of these, I think, excellent reconstructions have ever been published, a very tiny fraction, and then only in black and white. So most people have never seen these illustrations. Now, as it happened, Hansen's time with the museum coincided with the first major renovations to the geology department's exhibits since the year 1921, when the Field Museum, when it opened in its new permanent building in Chicago's Grant Park, with a large volume of very underutilized exhibit spaces. So for the next 2 decades, specimens were added to the existing exhibits on something of an ad hoc basis. A new specimen gets collected in the field, it gets added to the exhibits wherever it would fit in. And thus by 1939, right, a major overhaul of the exhibition space was definitely in order. And so in that year, Riggs, who was then curator of paleontology, drafted a new exhibit plan. The new plan called for the conversion of Hall 38. Sorry, there we go. I fell behind. The conversion of Hall 38, which is known as Ernst R. Graham Hall, for those of you who don't know, from a hall of paleontology into a hall exclusively for vertebrate paleontology. Now, this would be accomplished by removing the invertebrate and plant fossils to an adjacent hall, and the idea here was to display the evolution of vertebrate groups in a much more comprehensive manner. Now, the new exhibition would incorporate new specimens, and in many instances, newer and better mounts for older specimens. It would benefit from a roomier and more attractive layout of cases, and an overall reduction in the number of specimens exhibited. Central to the plan was the adoption of a new open specimen case design with enlarged exhibit space, bright fluorescent lighting, and crucially, no shelving. So here's a photo of the Oldstyle exhibit case, which shows a lot of overcrowding. Of course, this is fairly typical of 19th century museums. It's also typical of some 20th century museums, unfortunately. There's a lot of dark shadows in here, of course, and very little room for label copy on the back wall. Now here's a photograph of the new style of exhibit case. And as you can see here, omitting the shelves eliminates shadows, and it opens up the back wall like a vast canvas, something like 6 feet tall and 8 to 12 feet wide, depending on the case. And this is obviously a great place for a paleo artist like Hansen to hang his wares. So Hansen painted dozens of lifelike reconstructions. Again, I have no hard data on how many he worked on. I just know it must have been a huge number. These were then added to the exhibit cases one after another to give form and color, of course, to the specimens that were exhibited therein. So according to the museum's annual report, this is what they wrote about Hansen's contribution. They said, quote, "Life, color, and interest were added to a number of the exhibits by excellent oil paintings, the works of Mr. John Conrad Hansen. These carefully made pictures depict fossil animals in what was their most probable habitat." So there's the idea behind the philosophy behind putting these pictures in. All right, I just have a few examples which I'll show you. So here's the elephants and their extinct relatives. This is shown in this slide here. This is one of the first of the new cases finished with some of Hansen's paintings. 4 of them were featured in this particular case. As you can see, I only have a color picture, however, of this one. Others included, oh, that's out of order too. So others included the La Brea tar beds. Apparently I don't have a picture of that one. The great flightless bird. Oh, I'm sorry, that is the La Brea tar beds. When I look at this screen, I can't see it very well, unfortunately. So I should just look at this one. That makes more sense. So here's the La Brea tar bed, so I do have a picture. Also, the great flightless birds. I don't have a picture, unfortunately, of the case of the great flightless birds. Apparently no picture exists, but I do have a pretty good, fairly high-quality picture of the painting that used to hang in it, which no longer does, and also the skeleton upon which it was based, sitting right next to it. All right, likewise, new cases for pig-like mammals, for rodents. Oh, I think I have a picture of rodents too. Yes, I do. Rodents, shown here. Titanotheres, horses, and other animal groups, mostly mammals, all boasted one or more of Hansen's paintings. Really depended. At the same time, Hansen painted a series of explanatory cases was planned. These were designed to provide the requisite background information to understand and appreciate the fossil record, the fossil evidence on which these kinds of generalizations were based. These were also planned for Hall 38, a series of these. The first of these displays, showing the way in which fossils are preserved, discovered, and collected, debuted in December 1942. It featured, this is pretty interesting, it featured a series of 6 very memorable Hansen paintings. 5 minutes, wow, okay. Very memorable Hansen paintings. Here's the first one. I'm just going to cycle through these fairly quickly since I'm already running out of time, although this seems hard to believe. There we go. These are kind of cool, obviously showing how an animal dies and becomes buried and later turns into a fossil, and then, of course, as erosion exposes it, and there it is being collected in the 20th century. So these paintings, by the way, were still hanging in the Field Museum in the 1970s. I don't know how many of you have been to the Field Museum, but I remember these from when I was a kid, and they made a deep impression on me. As a matter of fact, I mean, I specifically remember seeing this painting and thinking that I wanted to be this guy right here. Right? Of course, I later changed my mind, threw my life away, and became a historian of science instead. All right. Now, finally, Hansen also painted reconstructions of 2 very rare animals from South America. Homolodotherium, shown here, and also Astrapotherium. He also sketched the skeleton earlier. There's a reconstruction. It's not a very good photograph, unfortunately. Now, as the Field Museum possessed the world's only complete skeletons of this animal, these very rare animals at this time, I believe Hansen's reconstructions are almost certainly the first ever made. All right, now regrettably, and I'll try to do this quickly, regrettably, Hansen's time at the museum, he had a lot of administrative difficulties during his period with the Field Museum. Late in 1938, his very first year, in fact, he received the Form 403, Notice of Change in Work Status, as he approached the WPA's mandatory retirement age. Of course, Hansen would turn 70 years old in 1939, so he started when he was 69, which is pretty late. Now, the Field Museum was able to get what they called a stay of execution on the basis that he still had a lot of important work to finish. Okay, the same thing happened again in May 1940 when Hansen was notified that he'd reached the 18-month limit for consecutive employment with the WPA. And at that time, with Riggs' support, Hansen appealed to the director of the museum to get regular museum employment, asking only that the museum match his very modest WPA salary. As a result, Hansen was given a 9-month appointment as artist in geology, with the idea being that he would finish the things that he'd already started. 9 months later, however, Riggs and Brian Patterson, who was now assistant curator of vertebrate paleontology, conspired to get this relationship made permanent. So conspired to get him a permanent job at the museum. Now, in this connection, Patterson wrote an endorsement of the high quality and versatility of Hansen's work that described his artistic skill and summarized his many contributions to the department. That's a very long quotation. I'm going to skip it because I have another one coming up. Now, Riggs forwarded Patterson's letter along with a selection of photographs of Hansen's artwork to the chief curator of geology for his recommendation, and of course this resulted in Hansen getting that permanent appointment. And this started in 1943. Now, unfortunately, the question of Hansen's employment was raised again in 1948, 5 years later, and once again, Patterson, Riggs is already retired by this time, Patterson steps in and writes a very interesting recommendation about Hansen's artwork, and this is what he had to say. So he wrote, "Mr. Hansen's work for this department has been of 2 kinds, line, pencil, and ink drawings intended for publication, and paintings and drawings for exhibition. As regards the first, I may say without exaggeration that he has no superior and few peers among either contemporary or former illustrators of fossil vertebrate remains. His work today is of the same high caliber as it was when he first joined us. Concerning his competence in the second, the restoration paintings he has done for Hall 38 speak for themselves. His only fault in this field is a tendency toward over-lavish use of bright color, and this we have usually been able to hold in reasonable check." But it gets better. So Patterson closed this letter, how many minutes? 2? Patterson closed this letter with some fantastic backhanded compliments. So he wrote, by way of conclusion, "He has very little originality. But this is actually an asset here, where the artist has to work in close collaboration with and under the restrictive supervision of a specialist. A complete lack of artistic temperament is one of his many very commendable qualities. So, to conclude, Hansen's oil paintings, I think, comprise the first systematic attempt by the museum's geology department to supplement its own fossil exhibits with full-color, lifelike restorations. This represents a significant departure from earlier field museum practice. The museum, when it opened in the 1890s, took a fairly minimalist approach to its exhibits. And in fact, here's Director Skiff's quotation about his philosophy. He said, he emphasized that a good museum must install its material with as little as possible to distract from the objects exhibited. Now, this idea gradually gave way, of course, as curators learned that they needed to try harder to attract interest in their particular collections, particularly the less fantastically interesting collections like rocks and minerals, things like that. But the same was true of paleontology. Now, the long delay in taking this new approach, right, supplementing these exhibits, is probably the result of the scarcity of resources devoted to paleontology by the geology department. Hansen's arrival, then, was an unexpected opportunity to upgrade the aesthetic appeal of the exhibits at relatively low cost. Full-color, lifelike restorations like Hansen's, which were pioneered in the United States anyway at the American Museum in the 1890s, are now widely seen as essential adjuncts for fossil displays. I think no one would dispute that. The restored whole animal, displayed alongside the fossil itself, of course, provides the museum visitor with the best opportunity to understand and appreciate extinct life. This is especially so in cases where the original fossil material is incomplete, or where it appears to the non-specialist as an incomprehensible jumble of rocks and bones. Hansen's paintings remained on display at the Field Museum until 1994, when halls 37 and 38 were deinstalled and the contents were moved to a much slicker exhibit. A selection of some, there's some more miscellaneous restorations. I keep falling behind. So a selection of some 25 of Hansen's decommissioned paintings have been assembled together for a popular display in a non-public area of the museum. This is a picture of that, while no fewer than 56 of his paintings reside in the collections. Finally, Hansen's illustrations adorn an unknown number of scientific publications. One day I'm going to know what that number is, but at present I don't. According to Rainer Zangrel, curator of fossil vertebrates, Hansen was, quote, an extremely conscientious worker, and loyal to his employers, giving little heed to himself. And though he was slight and frail and his eyesight was failing, he worked at the museum until a month before his death on 12 November 1952 at the age of 83. He's buried in Irving Park Cemetery on the northwest side of Chicago. Any questions?